Welcome to everybody who's tuning into this. It's great actually to be able to present some preliminary findings that are actually in the public domain, which I'm going to do through this presentation now, as well as generate a discussion around other issues in relation to the utilisation of midwifery units, which Leanne is going to help me with a little later on. So I'm going to present findings from the mapping of MUs in England that we've been doing in our project over the last 2 years or so. It's really an update from the Birthplace Study that published in 2010 that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And this first slide shows the increase in midwifery units over that 6-year period. So you can see nearly a doubling of AMUs, stagnation, slight increase in FMUs, and a reduction in the trusts that don't have MUs, quite substantially actually. So that's all a positive in relation to ongoing changes. You might be interested to know what the NICE intrapartum guidance says about birthplace choices in relation to midwifery units, and this is basically what it says, that all trusts should have an AMU and that a local FMU is desired either within the trust or in an adjacent area. So actually saying an adjacent area is a little bit woolly because that could mean a neighbouring trust. Maybe later on we might come back to that. That's sometimes a bit problematic. You'll see that there are 23 trusts that have both an AMU and an FMU. So they have maximum choice provision, but that only represents 17% of trusts. And then we've got 65% that have an AMU. The very best of them actually have both choices in multiple numbers. So there are 23 trusts, as I said, with AMU and an FMU, but some have got more than one FMU and some have got both that and more than one AMU. They're in trusts where there are 2 obstetric units under the one trust. And the worst you can see there with no MUs at all, even in places where there's more than one obstetric unit in a trust. Moving on to the next slide, this is just telling you about the capacity or the numbers of births that go through AMUs at the moment. It won't surprise you to learn that this number is relatively high compared with FMUs, which is the next slide. The vast majority of them are doing between 500 and 1,000 births, but there's a few that are really at the top end, over 1,500. I think 2,000 is the most that any unit in England does. Typically, these are in places that have got large obstetric units, as would make sense. If you're having a lot of births through your obstetric unit, in excess of 6,000 or so, then you'd expect, the AMUs to be picking up more births than the smaller obstetric units. This contrasts with the FMUs, where they're much smaller numbers of births. And as you can see there, many are less than 200. The majority are less than 200 and quite a lot of them under 100. What's interesting is that the ones that have got bigger numbers are those that have replaced a closed obstetric unit in a city or metropolitan area in the main. So that's happened in a few places, and there's a trend across England where you've got 2 obstetric units and 1 closes, or even 3 and 1 closes, and then they open up an FMU. Now clearly they're having more births because they're set in metropolitan areas, in larger population centres. So the challenge has always been in the rural settings, and you'll be familiar with the arguments about viability of how many births a year makes an FMU not viable. There's no real figure on that, but as you can see, a lot of people look at numbers under 100, and especially management and finance look at that figure, and we can come back to that and the future of small FMUs as we go through the presentation. So overall numbers of births in England, this is encouraging, have improved in relation to those that occur in MUs. It's gone from 3% there to 12%, or it's actually 14% when you put the FMUs in on top. Sorry, 5% to 14%. So that's nearly a trebling, isn't it, over a 4-year period. So that looks really positive when you look at it, and we have to say, yeah, that's great progress. But the key question for us is, what is the capacity for MUs? What would be a reasonable percentage of total births in an area that could go through them, and I want to move on to that. It's actually a difficult figure to work out because clearly during pregnancy there are points where women may develop complications and aren't suitable for MU births. So clearly at the health assessment at the beginning of pregnancy, a percentage of women will be classified as straightforward. Some won't and will have an obstetric referral. But then during pregnancy, a percentage of those will be transferred also to obstetric care because of complications developed in pregnancy. And then the final point is that during labour, another percentage will transfer because of intrapartum complications. So trying to get a handle on what's the potential capacity of births in MUs is complicated by that configuration. But the best evidence we got is from a study done in England. There is evidence from other countries, but their systems don't always mirror the UK's situation. This is a Sandal study from 2014 that showed 45% of women at the end of pregnancy were classified as midwife-led and therefore safe to birth in midwifery units or home. Now, during labour, we know that probably around 20% will be transferred. That's from the Birthplace Study, but there's lots of other data that sort of corroborate that as well. So you would expect to lose that sort of percentage in labour. So you'll see there a ballpark figure of around 35 to 36% who would be suitable to have their entire pregnancy and birth journey through midwifery-led services. So in other words, that kind of sets a little bit of a benchmark of what could be possible. So when we move on to see what actually happens in midwifery units in England, the picture is not as positive because you'll see there that most of them are getting 20% or less of those ones that are available and open. And there's only one that we found that was achieving 30% of their total population. So this is an issue of having access to midwifery units and then utilising the full potential of women in your population group to birth and labour in there. So we have some way to go to achieve that, as is clear from that slide. So in summary, 24% of trusts have no MUs, despite an explicit policy related to the NICE intrapartum guidelines. It's been around for 8 years or more. There have been a doubling in the numbers of AMUs, as we mentioned earlier. FMUs have stagnated. That's interesting because actually there's been follow-up research from the Birthplace Study showing their clinical outcomes are even better than AMUs. Always an interesting factor to look at to say, well, does the evidence lead to greater utilisation? And as we know, that's not always the case. Nevertheless, there has been a trebling in MU births over those 6 years since the Birthplace Study, most of it down to the AMUs. And then this wide variation across trusts in the way they utilise their MUs. We think 30% should be achievable, but the vast majority are under 20%. So we have some way to go. We've done further research on looking at the organisation of MUs and the facilitators and barriers in case studies that we haven't published yet, and we're still analysing and writing up. But what I'm going to do in the next section is talk a little bit about what we know from previous research about barriers to midwifery units, and then I'll hand over to Leanne to talk about women's perspectives on this specifically. So you've got 6 headings there, roughly categorising the major barriers to midwifery units from previous research, and we expect that our findings will reflect some of this and be able to amplify some of this. So one is around beliefs, that there are negative views that persist despite the evidence. One is about resources and priorities, and particularly in relation to FMUs, we know they're under financial pressure, due to their perceived underutilisation and low birth numbers. Some of it is about how care is organised in terms of women accessing them and how they should be staffed. And some is about leadership, about how you sort of sell the provision of midwifery units to your population of women and how you champion that. And we know from previous research that there's them and us issues around that interface too between midwifery units and obstetric units. There's also some data and some research around staff and the competence and confidence to work in a low-risk context. We've got previous research that says, although you'd expect that to be a given, actually there isn't always midwives who have the confidence to work in these settings. And then finally, there's a whole issue around change under the general heading of change management. We have decided in this presentation to talk about engaging with service users specifically with this, because we know that's a really important driver, and we want to make our maternity services sensitive and responsive to what service users are saying. So I'll introduce Leanne to talk about what we know already about women's views about place of birth choices, and she'll take over the next few slides in relation to that.
So hello everybody. So I'm Leanne. I'm one of the service user reps on this project. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, in addition to working on this project, I'm also the chair of the Maternity Voices Partnership in my local area, and I'm an antenatal educator as well. So I hear a lot of feedback from women about their experiences of choosing where to give birth to their baby. So just in terms of an overview of some broad themes of women's views, first of all, information and knowledge about midwife units is an important factor. There's wide variation in terms of the information that women receive about where to give birth, and particularly about midwife units. And that can be both within individual trusts and between trusts. So you find, women who are giving birth in a particular trust, different women have different information about their midwife units there, but also between different units, there's clearly lots of different information sharing going on. And that results in women having variable levels of knowledge about their choices. Next, influences on birthplace decision making. So women often say that they would be more likely to give birth in midwife unit if they are familiar with them. So they like to be able to go on a tour, see where they're going to give birth, and sometimes they may have had opportunity to see it. For example, if they've done some antenatal education there, that can really impact positively on their feelings about giving birth in that place. And continuity of care is something that women really express is important for them in terms of deciding where to give birth. So where they know they will achieve continuity of care by giving birth in a certain setting, that will encourage them to choose that place. Administrative and logistical issues are a really important thing that women talk about. And this is around choosing where to give birth, the booking process and the timing of the booking process. So often women say to me things like, I didn't know that I could change my mind. My midwife asked me where I wanted to give birth at the booking appointment. She wrote it down on the bit of paper, and then it seemed that that was written in stone. So there seems to be very little flexibility in terms of the process. And also women talk about where there's maybe not a midwife unit in their area, they find it difficult to access one where it may be in a neighbouring geographical area. So that's a very brief overview of women's views, but I thought you might be interested to know a little bit more about the service user involvement in this particular project. So there was 4 service users, including myself, involved in this project. The 4 of us were identified for this project via the Nottingham Maternity Research Network. The network was set up in 2014 by Professor Helen Spivey and her team of maternal health researchers at the University of Nottingham to enable women interested in maternity services to have significant input into the research that's happening at Nottingham University. So the network itself is made up of maternal health researchers and local women. I myself have been involved in the network since it was set up in 2014, and that's how I found out about this project and got involved in it. So I'm going to let Denis take the next slide, and he's just going to talk about how service users have been involved since the beginning of the project.
Thanks, Leanne. Yes, so when the proposal was drawn up, we were in contact with one service user in particular, who was the kind of first person who got involved in the network. And she was really helpful at reviewing the proposal, looking at the research questions we were exploring, seeing whether that chimed with what she thought were women's need, women's voices, and then looking at sort of data collection methods of eliciting women's voices and screening through the information for participants, which has to be quite robustly written these days according to ethical and research governance principles. So that was really helpful for us at the beginning. So I'm going to go back to Leanne now as we go to the next slide.
In the second stage of the project, in terms of service user involvement, this is a really, for me personally, a really exciting part of being involved in this project was involvement in the data collection. So one of the research methods is about focus groups, and the project ran focus groups with women in the 6 case study sites, hearing about their views, making a decision about where to give birth to their baby. So the project actually arranged for us to have training in preparation for facilitating the focus groups. They commissioned some independent trainers to come to the university and give us a half-day workshop. This was a really high-quality workshop. It was bespoke. The facilitators had a really good understanding about the project and around the needs of us as a team. The workshop was multidisciplinary, so everybody from within the team, so the researchers and the service users and the administrator, were all involved in the workshop. And I think the outcome of the workshop was, there was a few outcomes. I think it gave really good clarity to our roles and what was expected of us, what we needed to do in terms of the focus group facilitation. It helped us to really get to know each other as a team and feel confident and comfortable working together, and really gave us confidence to go out and to do the focus group facilitation. And then when we actually did the focus groups, the researchers set up the focus groups and we went along and met them in the case study sites. So it was one service user and one researcher per focus group. And I think having that team of 2 people, one of them being the service user, really helped the women in the focus groups to feel really safe and comfortable with sharing their experiences in a really open and honest way. So in terms of the next aspect of service user involvement, we were very much involved in the stakeholder workshop. And the stakeholder workshop was set up to bring together the wider stakeholders who have a role to play in facilitating the use of midwife units in England and facilitating choice around women's place of birth. The outcomes for the day were to identify interventions which could be effective in terms of increasing use of midwife units, and eventually then developing that into some recommendations for providers and commissioners, some guidance for them to use. So with the workshop, the service users were presenting the preliminary findings from the research. We facilitated the small group work that happened in the workshop, and then we were presenting feedback from that small group work as well. So we were very much involved in the day and very much on an equal footing with all of the other stakeholders at that time during the workshop. So Denis is going to talk about the next slide and the next steps for service user involvement in the project.
So yes, we're writing up the project now, completing the analysis, and we'll be producing papers and obviously a report. We're going to involve the service users in doing collaboration on papers, dissemination through social media, and presenting at conferences. That's probably going to be early part of next year or middle of next year, because the project finishes at the end of March. So
this slide is really about the value of service user involvement in the project. And I think no surprises here. It really helps the project to focus on the women's agenda, make sure that the team are asking the right questions about the topic. We can make sure that appropriate language is used in interaction with service users. So, particularly around setting up the focus groups, facilitating the focus groups, speaking to women about their experience, facilitates optimal data collection, and facilitates dissemination with service users. So I think that's a really important one that's yet to come, because I think often with research it is circulated within the academic world, but fails to be that useful because it doesn't really get heard by the people who really have a big impact on influencing women's decision making. So the benefit for service users, I think, is important because obviously there's a lot of benefit to the particular project, but for service users, actually being involved in this way is really valuable. Feeling valued, this is not only from a personal perspective, but it shows that the project and the team really values women's perspectives about health and well-being. It can develop skills and knowledge and confidence. It's particularly great for developing a woman's CV. Networking with others who share the same passions and interests can be really empowering, and it can lead to new collaborations. I'll mention about remuneration. The service users were remunerated for our involvement with this project. We received an honorarium for the time that we spent attending meetings and workshops, and the project also paid for our expenses. And this is something that I personally am really passionate about. I really believe that women's involvement in projects like this shouldn't be at personal cost to them and their family. The sorts of costs that women incur are travel, childcare expenses, leave from work. I know women who actually will take days off of their work to be involved in projects like this. I think that the project used the Involve guidance to help them to decide the amount of remuneration to offer to service users. But there's also NHS England guidance available, which is easy to find via Google search if you're interested in finding out more about that. So more benefits for service users, making a difference. Women like to use their own experience to make things better for women and families. That's really empowering. And lastly, it keeps professionals grounded in service user concerns. I think it's easy for people, professionals who are running projects like this to get carried away with their own ideas, but lose sight of what really matters to women. So it's just really quickly, final two slides, hints and tips for involving service users. Be clear about the commitment. So with this project, as service users, it was very clear to us how many times per year we were going to be needed, for how long, when and where. But the team was also really flexible, asking us when would be suitable times for us to meet, where would we like to meet. And also I would suggest if you're running something like this, consider teleconferencing, because that can help women who might not be as able to travel to join your meetings. Offer remuneration, so this can be a really big enabler, and it sends the message to women that we really value you, we value your knowledge, and we value your skills and your time. Involve service users from the beginning. So Denis has talked about how this project has done this. As a service user representative, I've been involved in many projects, some of them where all the work is done and then it's presented to the service users at the end. Ta-da, here it is, what do you think? And actually that's not involvement, that is communications and engagement, and it's not meaningful and it's not productive. Communicate clearly and openly. Certainly with this project, the team always encouraged two-way dialogue. They were always generous with information but never patronizing, and always asking us as service users, what do you need, how can we help to make this as good of an experience for you as possible. Consider offering training, which I've already talked about, and share power equally to avoid tokenism or paternalism. And I have to say, I have absolutely felt valued within this project, part of the team, part of the project. And I think something really easy that the team have done, but that has had such a big impact, is they've thanked the service users for their involvement at every opportunity.
Thanks very much, Leanne. Just want to acknowledge the team, because a lot more people have been involved in this than just the two of us. And, we're really grateful for their fabulous work.